Hello and welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Wang Yijun in Beijing. Coming up on today's program, the world's top bankers are gathered at Jackson Hole, Wyoming in the United States. Among them, Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen is expected to signal the future direction for interest rates in the U.S. Could rates be going up or will they hold steady? And what impact could that have on the global economy? And China's Alibaba hopes to make using Alipay easier for millions of Chinese who visit Europe every year. The e-commerce giant is teaming up with a French company as Alipay expands overseas. But how will that help consumers, and what are the risks to Alibaba? Welcome again to World Insight. The 2016 Economic Symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming is now underway. This annual gathering of central bankers provides important clues about what policymakers think of the U.S. economy and what moves they have in mind. Many major policy decisions are informally announced here, making it one of the most important events for global investors. At the symposium in 2012, former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke defended the Fed's quantitative easing, also known as QE policies. More importantly, he dropped hints of more QE to come. Then, following his comments in August, a month later, the Fed announced the QE3. At the 2014 conference, Fed Chair Janet Yellen spoke on the possible end of QE, and that made the U.S. dollar index soar. After being absent from last year's symposium, later today, Yellen will deliver a speech at the gathering, and it comes at a crucial time when the expectations for an interest rate hike continue to differ between the market and the Fed members. What does this mean for the global financial market, and will Yellen announce the rate hike? Before we move to our discussion, let's take a look at this.
While tourists soak up the scenery of Grand Teton National Park, bankers and economists are tucked inside this lodge, out of public view and away from reporters. They're discussing a very complex issue. How can the U.S. Federal Reserve and other central banks boost growth and jobs at a time when many world governments are reluctant to invest money of their own? The Fed has provided huge economic stimulus since the 2008 financial crash, but some analysts say it may be time to let rates rise.
The issue is interest rates are near historic lows, and they have been near historic lows for 7 years. The Federal Reserve has been pumping in hundreds of billions of dollars. When will this stop?
Good morning, everybody.
On Friday, Fed Chair Janet Yellen is expected to offer her take on the economy, send some sort of signal about when the central bank intends to resume interest rate hikes, and indicate how the Fed might tackle the next economic downturn at a time when growth is slow already. Some argue higher borrowing costs will only hurt average workers.
In that world that we're living in right now, why not try to get every job that we can, every gain in wages that we can, particularly when we know that at this point, the people who are going to benefit from that are disproportionately people of color.
On this Thursday afternoon, 8 members of the Fed's policymaking committee, some seen here last year, took the unusual step of meeting with members of Fed Up, an activist coalition of community and labor groups that wants the central bank to do even more to get the economy going. Investors on Wall Street and elsewhere hope that Yellen offers some sort of indication of when interest rates might finally go up. That increase may not happen for a while, but Yellen is expected to lay out the general monetary path ahead. Hendrik Sabrandi, CCTV, Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
For more on the Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium in Beijing, we have Mr. Xu Zhao, Chief Economist from Deloitte China. And in Washington, D.C., we have David Dollar, Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy and Global Economy and Development Programs at the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings Institution. And in London, we have John Ross, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Welcome, you gentlemen. Let me start with our Washington, D.C. guest, Mr. Dollar there. So tell us, how does this, some kind of regional a branch of the Federal Reserve Bank, become such an important talking shop?
Well, the Kansas City Fed has established a really nice tradition of having a meeting in late August, which is a pretty dead time, in an amazingly beautiful place. And so they get top bankers from around the world. It's really more of an academic conference. So I think it was a little bit misleading for people to expect that Janet Yellen would really indicate new policy. She's already started speaking And I think she's indicated that they're moving, she sees the U.S. economy moving toward what they call their dual mandate of healthy economic growth and employment on the one hand, and inflation moving to about 2% on the other. So she sees a case, strengthening case for higher interest rates, but she's not really tipping her hand. The market still thinks the odds of a move in September are quite low, maybe 1 in 3. Personally, I don't really expect the move to come until December. But she continues to emphasize that it's all data dependent, meaning that we need to get good economic results in the next few months for there to be any hike at all.
Let's talk about hikes later in this program, but I want to toss our next question to our London guest, Mr. John Ross there. So someone are calling this a Davos of central bankers. Is that an exaggeration?
Well, I think it is an exaggeration, except in the sense that Davos normally doesn't have the strongest possible Chinese representation because it's held too close to the Chinese New Year. And of course, you don't have the second most important central banker in the world, that is China there. So therefore, it's not really a power-making thing. What it is a major meeting of Western bankers. She has a very difficult situation because if you consider the growth figures in the US, they're pretty bad. I mean, the US GDP figures came out, second revision came out earlier today, 1.1% growth in the second quarter. That's annualized quarter. If you take year-on-year growth, I haven't had time yet to do the calculation on the revised figures, but on the earlier figures it was 1.2%, and that's slowed from 3.3%. So the US economy is not growing very fast. On the other hand, it is creating a lot of jobs. That's because productivity has now fallen for 3 quarters. So she's got some inflationary pressures potentially within the system. So she's got rather a difficult decision, in my opinion.
Mr. Chusatao, I saw you shake your head. Is it a difficult decision for Yellen?
Yes, well, in a sense, because she has been led by market forces, right? So in the long run, if the most important central bank continues to do that, you risk the risk of losing certain credibility. But I very much agree with what Dr. Dollar has said earlier. I think for the rest of the year, she's likely to do that once. But the trend is going to be very, very slow, very gradual, next few years.
So what would happen after this if she really announced that decision to raise the interest rate in December, like you said?
Well, if she does that, I think that's already being discounted by financial market. Then the question is how rapid the future rate hike will be. But I really think what the Fed is being confronted is very different from past, because these days you have to look at China. So some of the previous decisions actually being affected by conditions in China. That's something the Federal Reserve never have to deal with in past years.
Dr. Dollar, last year in December 2015, we saw a landmark interest rate hike by the Federal Reserve Bank, and then we're also seeing a stock market losing ground at the beginning of the first week of the year 2016. So what does that mean for this time if a possible interest rate hike would happen in December this year?
Well, when they made the first move in December of 2015, they thought the world economy was strengthening, but in fact, we then got very disappointing results for the U.S. China created some uncertainty with further depreciation of its currency in December 2015. So I think one move is not going to be a big deal, but the fact that they haven't moved since indicates that they were wrong to think that they were going to be on a steady path of global growth accelerating. There's a risk of this happening again. I agree that the market's pretty much priced in a move in December. Again, 125 basis point move is not going to make a big difference. They're projecting that the world economy is going to be accelerating. I really hope they're right, but they could be disappointed again, and we may find very few further interest rate hikes during 2017.
It's really interesting that we are all watching so closely at this possible interest rate hike. My next question goes to you, Mr. Ross. So some are worrying that the Feds are increasing this interest rate as to increase the market worries, and the others are saying that it'll also create bubbles in the stock market if they doesn't. So it's really a big deal for them to do or do not.
Well, when I said that they're facing a big decision, I mean, really, I'm thinking about the question whether to raise them in September. I've got little doubt that she'll raise them during either September or December, because she sort of boxed herself into a situation in which she doesn't. The Fed will lose a lot of credibility. But don't forget, at the beginning of the year, the projection was for 3 or 4 rate rises. So therefore, the rate rises are coming much more slowly than it was expected. On the question of asset bubbles, you have unprecedentedly low interest rates. I don't merely mean the Fed ones, but in Europe, you've got the lowest market interest rate for several centuries. Under those conditions, you're bound to have had the formation of asset bubbles, and there will be quite a significant market correction at some point when it's put up. It's another reason why, incidentally, the Fed will delay a long time before putting up interest rates. The fundamental reason, though, however, that the interest rates are so low is because the world economy is growing extremely slowly. In particular, if you take the US, the big news during the last year was not China, which slowed marginally from 7% in the first quarter of 2015 to 6.7% in the second quarter of 2016. The real big slowdown was inside the US, which was from 3.3% in the first quarter of 2015 to 1.2% in the second quarter of 2016. I think that's abnormally low. The US average growth rate the last 20 years is 2.3%. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some acceleration from this very low level during the rest of the year for the US, but nevertheless its fundamental growth rate remains very low, and the US is still the world's largest economy. It means one of the main modes of the world economy is not going very fast.
Well, Mr. Shistal here in our studio. So from 3.1% in the US to 1.1% of GDP growth in the US. After all, US is a really big economy. 1.1% is not that bad in terms of numbers. So we're also looking at possibly 3% of interest rate in the U.S. by the year 2018 or 2020. That means the bigger trend is still going up.
Yeah.
Are we that optimistic?
The bigger trend is still up. I think by large, U.S. economy is doing well. Labor market is strong. Housing market is strong. Of course, you have pocket weakness here, they're being affected by energy, by agriculture. But overall, I think U.S. economy is stronger than other major economies. But I think the challenge confronted by the Fed is you are going to have a few major central banks having negative interest rate. That's why one of the academic debate in this conference is how do we deal with nominal negative interest rate. I think another uncertainty potentially is China should cut interest rate. China should cut reserve requirement rate. If Fed is not raising interest rate, China would have done that already. So I think that's really the major challenge confronted by the Fed. You have this divergence between short-term interest rate between U.S. and many big economies.
Speaking of short-term versus long-term, in fact, Yellen's speech is titled Federal Reserve's Monetary Policy Toolkit. So what's in her box? Any ammunitions that she can use?
I think she already defended some of the tools, so-called unconventional monetary policies, asset purchase, so on and so forth. I think she already suggested should economic downturn return, those tools will be put in use.
So, of course, we're looking at any indications of how the Reserve Bank and other global central bankers would fight the next possible economic crisis. So, Mr. Dollar, what's your take on this toolkit?
Well, I think in her speech, she's emphasized that there are important factors in the world that are behind this slower growth. She cited the demographic factors, slowing of population growth, slower productivity growth. And so she's saying that probably peak interest rates are going to be much lower than they were in the past. We may only get a couple of Fed rate hikes before we have the next recession. And so she was defending the toolkit that the Fed used in the global crisis. And she's saying you have to expect central banks to be using these tools in the future. equilibrium interest rates are going to be lower than they were before, and therefore lowering interest rates is going to have less of an impact than it had in the past, and therefore you have to be ready for asset purchases and other types of extraordinary policies. So it's really kind of an academic speech where she's emphasizing what kind of tools they're going to have in the future the next time the U.S. and the world faces a recession.
But the question is, Mr. John Ross, will these tools be effective if a major financial crisis is facing us?
Well, there's two different things. One is I don't actually think a major financial crisis is confronting us. What I think is the situation is what Madame Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF, correctly called the new mediocre. But the tools of the US economy have been extremely ineffective. The economy has been slowing for the last 50 years. Its average growth rate has declined from 4.4% to 2.3%. And purely factually, during the last 18 months of the three big economic centres in the world, the US experienced the biggest slowdown. European GDP growth was 1.8% at the first quarter of 2015, and it's 1.8% in the second quarter of 2016. China went, so it didn't fall at all. China went from 7.0% to 6.7%, but the US went from 3.3 to 1.2%. So it's a pure myth that the US economy has been doing well. It has very high population growth, 0.8% a year. If you take US per capita GDP growth, it's 0.5% over the last year, which is, frankly, very anemic. And the jobs increase is not really an indication. The reason that the US economy is creating a lot of jobs is because its productivity has been falling for 3 successive quarters. So therefore the jobs indicator is not a good indicator of the strength of the economy at all. So therefore I don't expect to see it continue to fall. As I say, it's very abnormally low at present time. But all the evidence is that the tools are extremely ineffective in stimulating the US economy.
Dr. Dhalla, I would like to hear your response to Mr. John Ross' description of ineffective tools.
Well, I was speaking before. I think the monetary policy tools have done what they can, and I think we've reached a point where there's a limit to what you can do with only monetary policy. And in fact, Fed officials like Janet Yellen have been emphasizing this. The U.S. needs to do more with fiscal policy. We're not investing enough in infrastructure. With interest rates low and unemployed labor, we should be expanding our infrastructure spending. You know, we could do that with deficit financing initially, and then I think we need higher taxes eventually to pay for that. We need new trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think there's a structural and fiscal agenda for the United States that we're not acting on sufficiently. And given that, there's a limit to what monetary policy can do. And I don't have any complaint about what the Fed has been doing, but it's not being supported by Congress with other measures. It's not being supported with structural reform.
Just like I said, there's so much that monetary policy can do. But the topic of this year's symposium is called Designing Resilient Monetary Policy Frameworks for the Future. Mr. Xu Sitao, how do you explain this resilient monetary policy?
I don't know how to explain resilient. I do I do agree with David Dollar's view. I mean, you are seeing a diminishing rate of return of monetary policies, but at the same time, if we don't use such monetary policies, the situation could be much worse. So I think I got no answer to the so-called resiliency.
Dr. Dollar, what's your interpretation of this resilient? Because I don't understand. So help me.
Well, I think, you know, as I said, I think the Fed officials have been clear that while they're careful to criticize U.S. fiscal policy and structural issues, I think they've been pretty clear that the U.S. is not doing enough. And then they have to think about, given that, you know, what is the sensible monetary policy framework? And so I think, frankly, I think they've been doing a good job. I don't buy into this argument that, you know, that they need to get way out ahead of you know, the market expectations on raising interest rates. You know, they need to, they're doing what they can do in this environment, and they're thinking about how they can deal with a recession if it comes when their benchmark interest rates are still relatively low.
Let's take a look at a bigger picture. The aftermath of Brexit is still lingering, and we're also seeing volatility there. I would say that we're having one heck of a few post-Brexit tough months. So how would this put into the bigger picture of the global economy, Mr. Xu?
I think after the Brexit, first of all, stock market covered very quickly and nicely, and we've been seeing repeated new high of major stock market, U.S. particularly. So I think asset market has been quite sanguine, but at the same time, we also see reinforced strength of the U.S. dollar, which means strength of U.S. dollar would delay necessary increase of U.S. interest rate. And at the same time, I think after June 23rd, clearly UK economy will be in recession at some point. So that would exacerbate this divergence between US interest rate and the short-term interest rate of major economies. And that's a problem. I don't think anyone has good answer to that divergence.
Of course, the strengthening of US dollar will also mean some shockwaves throughout the emerging economy. So, Mr. John Ross there, what's your take on this?
Yes, it will. But I mean, the two economies that are doing very well at the present time are China and India, and they're not at all relying on monetary policy. They're relying on a huge increase in state investment. China's state investment up until July was up over 20% year on year, and India's also up 20% year on year. I think the difference is the Western economies have been relying really on monetary policy, and China and India have been also adding to that big stimulatory investment policies. So I don't see any reason why India and China should be deeply shaken by any increase in federal interest rates. It will have a negative effect in those economies which don't really undertake state investment. Places like Brazil, for example, and it may have some negative short-term effect on China's financial markets, but it's not going to fundamentally derail either China or India's economy. It'll have some effect outside of these biggest developing economies, which are really in a class of their own at the present time.
Mr. Ross, our studio guest here would like to weigh in on this. Mr. Xu.
Yeah, I think I'm not too sure whether I share that sentiment towards a stimulus package, because right now we are still paying the price for what was being done in November 2008, the so-called 4 trillion RMB stimulus package. That's been well recognized. Has to do with asset quality, has to do with overcapacity. So right now we have a very big battle to fight, I mean, in several sectors. So I think at this point, we should be very, very careful about fiscal stimulus.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for this part of discussion, but keep in mind that Janet Yellen's speech will happen right after this program. That's 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday. We'll be keeping an eye on that. Thank you very much, Mr. Xu Sital, Mr. David Dollar, and Mr. John Ross. Stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming up. China's e-commerce giant Alibaba hopes to capture more of the market of Chinese shoppers in Europe. And it's teaming up with a French company to expand Alipay overseas. But what would that mean for consumers, and what are the challenges Alipay is facing? Stay with us. Welcome back to World Insight. Now we turn to China's leading mobile payment servicer, Alipay. Last week, Alipay unveiled its partnership with Ingenico, a Paris-based payments and terminals producer. A joint venture between these two will allow millions of Chinese tourists to pay by using Alipay e-wallet in stores when they travel to Europe. Though Alipay still has to negotiate with banks and other agents to complete this operation, experts are being very optimistic about the outcome. Before talking with our panels, let's take a look at this.
Pushing into Europe, Alipay, the mobile payment service run by Alibaba Group's financial affiliate Ant Financial Services Group, has struck an alliance with French payment processing group Ingenico. 2015 saw 13.2 million Chinese tourists visiting Europe, and many of them were Alipay users. So far, they've had to use cash or alternative payment methods in Europe. An Ingenico official says payment becomes a friction for business. So we are removing this friction by allowing the retailers to capture sales to the Chinese tourist population. The partnership between Alipay and Ingenico would allow thousands of European merchants, from supermarkets and big retailers to restaurants and bars, to accept payments in-store via the Alipay mobile app. Last year, there were 120 million Chinese visitors who traveled abroad, and they spent $104.5 billion US. Alipay has already eyed this market. Its ambitions in Europe are part of a wider international push. Back in 2007, Alipay marched into Southeast Asia. Then it built partnerships with several big retailers in Japan, which is a hot destination for Chinese tourists. Cooperation with Russia's VTB Bank and the U.S. Macy's retail chain has also been established. As the leader in mobile payment service in China, Alipay is on the way to expand its global markets. Its achievements have shown Chinese companies how to work with global partners to reach win-win relationships.
For more on Alipay's expansion to Europe, we are now joining in our Beijing studio by Jay Huang, founding partner of Jadestone Venture and former managing director of Intel China. In Berlin, we have Mike Bastin, visiting professor at Beijing's University of International Business and Economics. And in New York, we have Ari Zoldan, CEO of the Quantum Media Group. Welcome, gentlemen, to our discussion here. Let me start with Mr. Bastin there. So Alipay has long been trying to push into foreign markets. So what's so special about this move that allowing Chinese consumers to use Alipay in Europe?
Well, I think it's very special indeed. It's extremely significant that this venture will take Alipay into the more lucrative European markets, countries such as France, Italy, Switzerland and Germany, where increasing numbers of Chinese tourists now venture and spend increasing amounts of money. I mean, the figures are increasing, 12% increase in number of tourists visiting Europe last year compared with the previous year, and a 17% increase in the amount they spend. So it's a real major stepping stone for Alibaba generally to enter the more lucrative international markets and not just markets closer to home. And it's a very, very important step for the internationalization generally of Chinese industry, which is a very, very important feature of the now new Chinese economy.
Mr. Huang, but this service is only limited to Chinese consumers. It's not targeting Europeans. So is this only a first step of the very first step into Europe?
I think this should be the first step. For any company, penetrating to international turf is not easy. So usually they need a partner. Now they got one. The other one is they really want to find some launching board. Now, like a Chinese tourist, are very good on the launching board for Alibaba. I think that this is a smart strategy for penetrating into the international turf.
But it's not easy, of course. Let me turn to our New York guest there, Mr. Zoldan. Do you think this will be a smooth path for Alipay?
Listen, I think it's a great opportunity for the business community, for the end user as well. Look, we're living in this shared economy right now. To be able to transfer money to and from different organizations, whether it's financial institutions or peer-to-peer. And I think Alipay is really, they're setting a precedent right now to be able also to follow the tourism community, which I think is quite extraordinary, and quite frankly, it's very, very smart. And we are going to start seeing a precedent right now of other companies starting to follow the tourists.
And besides payment, Mr. Huang, Alipay is also saying that they try to connect merchants with the consumers. Is that a smart move, or will there be any complication in it?
I think that's a smart move too. You look at most of Chinese tourists, originally they are going abroad on their guided tour. Most of them like in a group. And then when they arrived into the foreign countries, and then the local people take them, whatever they want to be as a group. But nowadays, more and more people are self-serving. And then when they go into the new countries and they run into the challenge and where to find like a restaurant or the interest place, in the international side of it, for example, if the U.S. travelers are going to Europe, they can use the application they call the Trip Advisor to find out what's the most interest for them. There's not much on those applications for Chinese tourists. So I think Alipay really found a niche and also the need and for the Chinese tourists. I think this is also a good starting point.
Of course there's need, but I have a concern that because we're entering a mobile internet era, some would say that the applications, we call apps, would be the lighter the better. If it's a payment application, you just use it to pay without attaching so much social networking functions into it. So, Mr. Baston, what's your take on this?
I think that's a genuine concern. I think the average Chinese tourist, certainly from my research, would welcome further services. Has just been said that the Chinese tourist, I think, will be pleased that not only can they pay using Alipay, but they can also find out more about local amenities, shopping centers, restaurants, theaters, bars. The typical Chinese tourist travels a lot when they travel to Europe. They're moving around from city to city, country to country. So additional services are very, very highly valued. So I don't think they'll see that as a burden. It would also be very welcome from the merchants who can find out much more about Chinese tourists. And at the moment, they know very, very little about this very different type of tourist.
But if you've seen the recent update by Alipay, it has significantly expanded. It has added a lot of social networking function into the Alipay app. Is it a good trend or not, Mr. Huang?
I think they have to do that. You look at their rival in China, for example, on Tencent, like a WeChat, and we also see the same trend, like and Tencent expand the WeChat use. Originally, just for chatting. Right now, they got a telephone services added on. They also have expanded into some enterprise uses. For example, you transfer all your PPT and through the WeChat. You even have a conference call on the WeChat, and also WeChat also have their payment system. So you can see this is looks like in China we see some consolidation into the app side of it, and then people are heavily rely on using a few apps and as compared to use a lot of apps and each for a special need. So I think that it is a trend.
It is a trend, of course, but is it a smart move to do? I would like to ask Mr. Zoldan there. For instance, Facebook is also integrating some payment function into its messenger to order burgers or office appliance through its messenger service. Is it a winner takes all kind of situation, or users still have a lot of varieties to choose from?
Well, it's a good question, and I think, to address your first point, it's an obvious evolution, and I think that as these individuals, as these organizations get closer to the money, it's so much about convenience. Look, if you look at, fascinating, if you look at Uber doesn't own a single car. Airbnb doesn't own a single housing, a piece of real estate. It's just a level of technology that enables the end user to be able to do things out of ease and convenience. So, is it a trend? It's more than a trend, I think. I think it's going to become a real reality. But what's really interesting for me, quite frankly, is when you have these big institutions, whether it's banks or merchants, being able to merge and be able to break into certain markets. It's the smaller companies that are able to benefit from it also by wrapping themselves around it, whether it's data storage needs or secure transfers, companies like Datomia or companies like Pipestream that are communicating directly with the end users and being able to send push notifications. So it's not only about the payments, quite frankly, it's about, I think, the overall ecosystem, which for me is quite fascinating.
Well, the ecosystem is actually a buzzword here in China. When you get closer to the money, maybe you get ambitious, maybe you become greedy. Well, let's take a look. The past 3 years saw a rapid expansion of Alipay in overseas market. In the year 2012, the International Business Division was founded to focus on overseas market. Since January of 2015, it pushed into overseas market for offline payments, and by January, cold scan payments were accepted in over 70,000 merchants from around 70 countries. And in the next 3 years, Alipay hopes to upgrade mobile payment service for 1 million merchants. So, Mr. Huang, what do you think of this ambition, and what are the obstacles that Alipay will be facing?
Like any company going to international turf is not easy. Like in China, we see so many international companies, internet companies coming to China. I think most of them, if not all of them, actually failed to survive in China. So we started wondering whether the reciprocal is also true, like a Chinese company may not be able to survive internationally. And so this jury is still out. But at least we see several things Alipay did right or did well. First, they got a partner, international partner, and it looks like they're not just trying to do everything by themselves. Secondly, they're really rely on the Chinese and tourists as a launching board. That's pretty much their install base in China. So this will help them to be successful, at least to be survive and at the beginning.
Mr. Baston, of course, Alipay will be facing strict regulations locally and, of course, strong competitors. What's your take? What are the chances of Alipay succeeding?
I think that the chances are high. I think in recent years, many Chinese companies now have shown that they can compete in international markets, penetrate those markets and build their brand very competitively, not just compete on price. So we're looking at Huawei, Lenovo, Dalian Wonder, and I think Alipay and Alibaba are probably following suit, and they're increasingly, I think, determined and self-confident and very rational in their analysis and their planning, as has been said, with a very, very good choice of partner. There will be challenges, technical challenges, legal issues, and cross-cultural issues. But I think this new breed, almost, I think, of Chinese management is very, very capable here. And I see that very, very strong chances of real success. Younger generations are leading Chinese industry in a very, very more modern way. We don't see Jack Ma perhaps as public as he used to be. And I think that there is a far more serious, rational, modern management structure and strategy in place at Alibaba, and I think that the chances of success in these more lucrative markets are very, very strong, with an increasing number, obviously, of Chinese tourists and demand there for them.
Now, Mr. Zoldan, are you that optimistic? Can you give us an analyze these strengths and weaknesses of, for instance, Apple Pay, the Google Android Pay, and Alipay?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be challenging from a natural learning curve. Obviously, Americans are very, very comfortable, with using a lot of their own technology and their own language as well. Obviously, Apple has a very, very strong brand here, and Americans, as I've always said before, are huge brand junkies. The same thing with Android. So Alipay, I think, is going to have an uphill battle, but I think that part of their answer to that is really about collaboration and not so much competing. If Alipay can work in conjunction with a lot of these other companies, American-based companies, I think their chances of success are going to be much greater.
Last but not the least, let's talk about some technical issues. For instance, the protection of private information when you use your payments, and of course, Alipay has a lot of data regarding the consumer's habits and buying routines. It has very, very wisely guessed that what kinds of merchants or what kind of products do you want to buy. So how do you protect all these informations?
This is going to be very interesting. First of all, I think Chinese consumers' information, I don't know how much the regulation for the internet company, they can share or they can use it. Looks like they may have lots of more freedom in China to handle those data. I don't know when the travelers going to the overseas, and do they follow which country's regulation? So that's
technicality.
The first issue, if they follow the Chinese and the regulation, and then maybe provide better and access to the consumers' data to lots of the local shops, and so that's maybe help the local shops to boost their business. So that could be a leverage for Ali.
That's, of course, an ongoing discussion. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was Mr. Jay Huang, Mr. Mike Basson, and Ari Zoltan. That'll do it for today's World Insight. And if you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Wang Yizhi, and everyone here at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world. Goodbye.